In this video, we are going to be examining some of the philosophical themes of Disney's 1967 film, The Jungle Book, which is loosely based off of the character Mowgli in Rudyard Kipling's 1894 book of the same name. The original film was a box office success and has since become a Disney classic. Since its original release, it has been adapted and remade in various ways. Disney released a live-action adaptation in 1994 and an animated sequel called The Jungle Book 2 in 2003. More recently, a live-action remake, also called The Jungle Book, directed by Jon Favreau, was released in 2016. And in 2018, we had Andy Serkis's live-action Mowgli: Legend of the Jungle. These remakes obviously attest to the success and appeal of the original. As a result, and for the sake of brevity, this video will mostly focus on the original from 1967, although I may refer to other versions where appropriate. If you haven't seen the movie, I'll include a link in the description. It's well worth a watch. Either way, I'll now give a brief summary of what happens in the film to give you the gist if you haven't seen it, or to refresh your memory if you have. So, obviously, warning, spoiler alert. The film begins when a young orphan boy, Mowgli, is found wrapped in a basket in the jungles of India by a black panther called Bagheera. Bagheera then takes Mowgli to a mother wolf called Raksha and her partner Rama, who have just had cubs. Raksha and Rama then raise Mowgli alongside their own cubs. We then fast forward 10 years, and Mowgli has now become well acquainted with jungle life and plays with his wolf siblings. Bagheera is pleased with Mowgli's progress, but he worries that Mowgli must eventually return to his own kind. One night, Mowgli's adopted parents join the rest of the wolf pack for a meeting at Council Rock. Reports have emerged that the ferocious and terrifying Shere Khan, a man-eating Bengal tiger, has returned to the jungle. After a heated discussion, Akela, the pack leader, decides that Mowgli must leave the jungle for his own safety. Bagheera, who is in attendance, volunteers to escort him to a man village. They leave that same night. However, Mowgli is determined to remain in the jungle. Growing weary from their travels, he and Bagheera stop for the night to rest in a tree. There, Kaa, an enormous Indian python, tries to eat Mowgli. Thankfully, brave, protective Bagheera intervenes, saving Mowgli's life. The next morning, Mowgli sneaks off whilst Bagheera sleeps and tries to join the elephant patrol led by Colonel Hathi and his wife Winifred. Bagheera finds Mowgli and extricates him from the patrol. However, the two soon get into a fight, which causes Bagheera to storm off, leaving Mowgli on his own. Mowgli soon meets up with the laid-back, fun-loving sloth bear, Baloo, who promises to look after Mowgli himself and never take him to the man village. Bagheera, upon calming down, repents and returns to find Mowgli. He finds Baloo and Mowgli and then watches them from a distance, making sure that Mowgli is safe. It is at this stage that Baloo teaches Mowgli his philosophy of life through the song The Bare Necessities. We shall return to this topic later in the video. Soon after, a troop of monkeys kidnaps Mowgli and take him to their base in the abandoned ruins of a human palace, and then to their leader, the orangutan King Louie, who for some reason becomes a Gigantopithecus in the 2016 version. King Louie offers to help Mowgli stay in the jungle if he will show them how to make fire. The song I Want to Be Like You then reveals that King Louie wants to be like humans and thinks that access to fire will bring him closer to this goal. Unfortunately for Louie, since he was not raised by humans, Mowgli does not know how to make fire. Bagheera and Baloo then arrive to rescue Mowgli. The monkeys, led by King Louie, unsuccessfully try to stop them escaping, and in the ensuing chaos, King Louie's palace is destroyed. That night, whilst Mowgli is sleeping, Bagheera speaks to Baloo and convinces him that the jungle will never be safe for Mowgli with Shere Khan around. Next morning, Baloo explains to Mowgli that it is best for him to live in the man village. Mowgli feels betrayed and is extremely upset, and as a result, he runs away. Baloo then sets off in search of Mowgli, whilst Bagheera rallies the help of Hathi and his patrol to help find Mowgli. Unbeknownst to them, however, Shere Khan has been eavesdropping on Bagheera and Hathi's conversation and sets off to hunt and kill Mowgli himself. Whilst all this is going on, Mowgli encounters Kaa for the second time, who once again tries to eat him. Fortunately, Mowgli escapes thanks to the unintentional intervention of Shere Khan. Mowgli continues to wander alone in a depressed state whilst ominous storm clouds gather. He then encounters a group of friendly Liverpudlian vultures who accept Mowgli into their group. However, Shere Khan soon appears. The vultures flee, leaving Mowgli alone to face the tiger. Suddenly, Baloo appears and heroically rushes to the rescue. Unfortunately, he is soon overpowered by Shere Khan and is nearly killed. Lightning strikes a nearby tree and sets it ablaze. The vultures return and try to distract Shere Khan. Meanwhile, Mowgli grabs a flaming branch and ties it to Shere Khan's tail. The tiger, who is terrified of fire, panics and runs away, and Mowgli and his friends are victorious. As a side note, I always wondered why Shere Khan was so easily able to overpower Baloo, given Baloo is a bear. Surely a bear could have a tiger for breakfast, literally. Well, I found out whilst doing research for this video that Baloo is a sloth bear as opposed to a brown or black bear. Male sloth bears can weigh anywhere from 80 to 145 kilograms, which isn't much bigger than your average man, as Bengal tigers, which is what Shere Khan would have been, can weigh up to 325 kilograms, as well as being much more ferocious than sloth bears. So it kind of makes sense that Shere Khan was easily able to overpower him. At the same time, it does make Baloo's actions all the more heroic. You learn something new every day. Continuing with our narration, fresh from their victory over Shere Khan, Bagheera and Baloo at long last arrive with Mowgli at the outskirts of the man village. Mowgli is still hesitant to enter. However, he changes his mind when he sees a beautiful young girl from the village coming down to the riverside to fetch water. She soon sees Mowgli watching her, and so she accidentally drops her water pot. Mowgli retrieves it for her and then follows her into the man village. As he enters, Mowgli shrugs to Baloo and Bagheera to show that he has decided to leave the jungle and go to the man village. Baloo and Bagheera then return to the jungle, content in the knowledge that Mowgli is happy, safe, and with his own kind. This brings the film to an end. I am sure there are many philosophical themes that could be drawn out of this film, but for me, when watching it, the most interesting character from a philosophical perspective was Baloo the bear. His philosophy of life is nicely summed up in his song, The Bare Necessities. I'll include the lyrics in the description, so perhaps have a quick look at those if you haven't seen the film. But the gist of his philosophy, and of the song, is that we should only seek the essentials we need to survive, the bare necessities, whilst relaxing and enjoying life. He seems to be very skeptical of material luxuries, and he seems to think that happiness can be found by taking life as it comes, not seeking more than is necessary, and through enjoying the free things in life. He also seems to be suspicious of many of the social conventions of his fellow jungle dwellers. For example, when explaining to Baloo why he cannot adopt Mowgli, Bagheera asserts that creatures should stay with their own kind, that birds of a feather should flock together. He then rhetorically asks whether Baloo himself would want to marry a panther. However, rather than denying this, Baloo simply chuckles, says he doesn't know, and then suggestively points out that no panther has ever asked him, whilst affectionately nudging Bagheera in the ribs. Clearly, Baloo is happy to buck the social norms of the jungle. All of this together is strongly reminiscent of the ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. Whilst Baloo seems to be more agreeable than historical accounts would suggest Diogenes was, the two seem to share a common philosophy of life. So, what did Diogenes believe, and how did he live? In everyday language, cynicism conjures up negative images, pessimism about human nature, and skepticism about the sincerity of human ethical norms, motivations, and behaviors. Historically, however, whilst there is some truth to this view of cynicism, the view is a little more nuanced and perhaps less negative than we might think. Cynicism as a school of thought can be traced back to the ancient Greek philosopher Diogenes. Diogenes of Sinope, who lived from 404 to 323 BC, was a Greek philosopher. He was born in Sinope, hence his name, which is in modern-day Turkey. As an adult, he was driven into exile from his homeland for defacing currency. He then lived much of the rest of his life in Athens, although he died in Corinth. There are many accounts of his life. The historicity of all of them can be challenged to a greater or lesser extent, but a number of themes emerge which might tell us something important about the actual historical figure. According to most accounts, when Diogenes came to Athens, he met the famous philosopher Antisthenes and asked to be his student. Antisthenes at first refused him, but Diogenes stubbornly persisted in his request, and eventually Antisthenes was worn down and accepted him as a student. Like Antisthenes, Diogenes believed in the importance of virtue and in the rejection of unnecessary luxuries. However, he took this much further than his teacher, and even rejected personal possessions and social status. For him, possessions were a trap. He was so committed to his beliefs that he took up residence in a large wine cask, although some sources claim it was an abandoned bathtub, in the marketplace of Athens. He owned nothing and lived entirely off of the charity of others. One famous account of his life reports that he owned a cup from which he drank and ate. However, one day he saw a boy drinking water from a fountain, using just his cupped hands. Diogenes flung his cup away, ran up to the boy, and heartily thanked him for showing him that even the cup was unnecessary. Another account reports that he walked round the marketplace of Athens in the daytime, holding a lantern or candle to the faces of passers-by, whilst claiming that he was searching for an honest man, the point being that he couldn't find one amongst all the citizens of Athens. Another time, at a banquet for some wealthy Athenians, some of the guests threw Diogenes some scraps whilst calling him a dog. In response, Diogenes lifted up his leg and urinated on them, just like a dog would. In spite of, or perhaps because of, his outrageous behaviour, Diogenes was genuinely loved by the Athenians. According to one account, when a boy broke Diogenes' cask, the people had the boy beaten and then replaced the broken cask at the public expense. Another account reports that he met Alexander the Great, who you've probably heard of. The account states that when Diogenes was living in Corinth, Alexander came to the city and wanted to meet the philosopher. He eventually found Diogenes resting in the warm sunshine. Alexander introduced himself and asked if there was anything he could do for him. Diogenes replied, "Yes, get out of my sunlight." Alexander admired his spirit and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." To which Diogenes replied, "If I were not Diogenes, I would also wish to be Diogenes." In another account of their interaction, Alexander found the philosopher looking attentively at a pile of human bones. Upon being questioned, Diogenes explained, "I am searching for the bones of your father, but cannot distinguish them from those of a slave." Clearly, Diogenes was neither impressed nor intimidated by power and authority. Whilst the historicity of many of these accounts can be challenged, a number of Diogenes' core teachings can be identified. Clearly, Diogenes was deeply suspicious of material possessions. He clearly believed that they contribute little to our well-being and virtue, that at best they may be distractions, and that at worst they may actively lead us away from goodness and happiness. He was also clearly suspicious of many of the Athenians' social customs. He believed that what people called manners were simply lies used to hide the true nature of the individual, and that brutal honesty and openness was the solution. Although many people will think that Diogenes was probably mentally ill or something, as did many of his contemporaries at the time, Diogenes would have claimed that he was simply living a completely honest life, and that others should have the courage to do the same. So what do I make of Diogenes' philosophy? Well, it seems to me that there is something to his philosophy. However, at the same time, it is so extreme as to be impractical. With regard to his insights, I think there is some truth in his suspicion of the value of material possessions. In the West, most of us have far more than we really need, and yet we are also endlessly trying to accumulate more and more wealth. The question then becomes, does this really make us happy, both as individuals and as a society? Perhaps if we were all content with a little less and shared things more fairly, we could all enjoy a good enough standard of living whilst avoiding the constant stresses, strains, and pressures of modern life. Perhaps the end result of endlessly pursuing more and more is that a minority of people end up ridiculously rich at the expense of everyone else, including the very poor, whilst everyone, including the rich, end up feeling exhausted and stressed. So nobody really wins. Maybe if we all took life slower and divided things up more fairly, we'd all be happier and less stressed. I think there's some truth in that. I think Diogenes is also right in placing the emphasis on genuine virtue rather than on artificial manners. There are many people who are outwardly respectable whilst being fairly despicable behind closed doors and on the inside. At the same time, I don't think this insight should be used as an excuse for rudeness, and I think that Diogenes sometimes did this. However, the biggest problem with Diogenes' philosophy, it seems to me, is that it is just too extreme. His philosophy seems to demand that we all become penniless and homeless, and very few of us, if any of us, would ever do that. So I think his philosophy is simply too extreme to be practical. If a philosophical system makes prescriptive claims that nobody would ever agree to, then it seems to me that this clearly counts against the plausibility and usefulness of the system. Perhaps, however, we can take some of his basic insights whilst toning it down in order to make it more practical, so we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. Perhaps both as a society and as individuals, we should be satisfied with enough and have a clear idea of what that constitutes and when we have achieved it. That might get the balance right. I guess the question then becomes, what is enough? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that. How big should our houses be? How fancy our cars? How exotic our holidays? So I'm not sure I know how much at the end of the day is enough. I suspect it will always be, or at least feel like, a bit more than you currently have. And perhaps that's the problem. So there we go. Is Baloo a cynic? More friendly and less lewd than the historical Diogenes, but a cynic nonetheless. Does Baloo challenge us by reminding us that our possessions own us as much as we own them, that the pursuit of worldly status and pleasures is a foolish quest, just like Diogenes did for the ancient Athenians all those years ago? Further, if he is a cynic, can we learn anything from him? Should we simply pursue the bare necessities so that we can forget about our worries and our strife? Or is material success and hard work the secret to happiness? What do you think? Be sure to let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I look forward to seeing our next video on the wisdom of Disney. But until then, I hope that, at the very least, the bare necessities of life do come to you. Take care. Goodbye.